My name is Jacob Roram. I do public programs here at the History Center, and I'm really delighted that we get to have this program today. As you can see, it's a popular choice and topic, and I can't take credit for it. This was actually put together by my colleague, Akoma Gaither, who excitedly got a great opportunity at History Colorado and moved on, so she passed the torch to me to be able to just finish the execution of this program, and we have a great speaker for you today. I want to draw attention to, there's a few programs I listed on the back of your programs, upcoming things that we have coming up. We've got History Forum, which is a great lecture series bringing historians from all across the country to here. Next February's talk is with Blake Scott Ball, who wrote a wonderful book called Charlie Brown's America, The Popular Politics of Peanuts. Goes along with our Life and Art of Charles Schulz exhibit. Next weekend, next Sunday, we have a terrific duo, James Curry, who's a local producer and historian. He does sort of amateur history. And a wonderful comic artist, Tom Nguyen. Tom works for DC, Marvel, all the big comic houses. They collaborated to create a comic book about James's families, who was one of the first black families to settle in Hastings, Minnesota. They founded, with another family, the first black church in Hastings, and that church was burned down in an act of racial violence in 1907. So he paired up with Tom to try to create a comic book that tells that difficult history. So bringing difficult histories to new generations in a new form. So that's going to be a really exciting conversation to see what they've done with that. And then we have a lot more, so please go to our website and check out all the great events we have coming up this spring, including there's going to be a lot that's going to be announced soon for our Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow exhibit, which opens February 3rd. Brand new exhibit that's going to be upstairs, so please come back and check that out when it opens. Without further ado, let me introduce I did want to mention, some of you saw the film that was playing earlier. That is a film just titled End of an Era, which was, in some ways it seemed kind of strange they were celebrating the end of the streetcars here. And I'm sorry to have subjected you to the terrible image of them burning streetcars. But it really captures the ways that our thinking about particular moments in history changes over time, right? In the 1950s, the streetcars were seen as old. They were ready to be taken out. They were looking forward to the new and improved technology of buses. And of course, now we're spending a lot of money to put streetcars and trains back in. If only we had just kept those and kept developing them, but oh well. But this is a great example of things that we have in our collections here at MNHS, and our media archivists do a great job digitizing this stuff. So a lot of it never gets to see the light of day because you have to go up to our library and request specifically to look at these things. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to showcase some of the things we have in our collection. So that's what you got to see there. Without further ado, as we're letting people trickle in, as some folks do, our speaker today, Aaron Isaacs, has a long career, first working for Metro Transit and also at the same time for many decades volunteering at the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. He's a wealth of knowledge on this subject. He's also got some books here. He can sell some of those to you if you have a exact change with you. Otherwise, check out his books. They're listed in your program at your local bookstore. I always prefer to not try to buy things from a store that has the same name as a large river, but do what you will. Support your local bookshops is always my encouragement. But he's a wonderful person to have here, and please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Thank you. Let's see now. Yeah, everybody hears me all right? Good. They were nice enough to provide a stool. I'm of the age my knees get a little sore if I stand for an hour, so I'm mostly going to sit here. What I'm going to do is take you first on kind of a mini history of how streetcars came about, and then what we're going to do is tour the state, and I'm going to show you all the places they were, because I think there were probably some places where you didn't even know they were. So this is kind of a classic view here. You know where this is, right in front of the state capitol, the streetcar, which is on the Como-Harriet line. This track was shared by the Como-Harriet line and the University Avenue line, the Hamlin-Cherokee line that came in out of Frogtown, and the Rice and South St. Paul line. They all use this track, and it's turning onto a piece of street that doesn't exist anymore, which is a piece of Wabasha Street from between Martin Luther King Drive, which was at the time Constitutional Drive. From there down to 94, they took out Wabasha, but that's where this thing is. So, start with the basic thing of why were there are train tracks in the street, which, you know, if you think about it, that's kind of a bad place to put a train. But there's a reason for it. And if you've ever gone to any of the colonial era cities, you know, the old part of Boston or Charleston, South Carolina, or in Annapolis, Maryland, they were all back in that day maybe about a mile square. And if you wanted to get around the town, you just walked. You could walk conveniently anywhere. So in the early 1800s, along comes the Industrial Revolution. People come pouring in from the countryside, the population swells, and suddenly the cities become too big to just walk around in. You needed some kind of transportation if you were going to reasonably get from one side of town to the other. And people, except for the very wealthy, they didn't have horses or carriages. And so they had to come up with some form of public transportation. And what they came up with were large carriages that you could go and pay a fare on, and they called them omnibuses, which is where you get bus from. But, you know, pulled by horses, not a terribly satisfactory technology, although there were a lot of them. But if you had a street with cobblestones, it was a very rough ride. Remember, there's no cushioning or anything. Most of the streets were dirt, which turned to mud when it rained. And so they were looking for something better. And along in the 1830s comes railroads. And it didn't take too much to discover that if you had an iron wheel rolling on an iron rail, you got first a smooth ride, no matter whether it was muddy or not, or whether it was cobblestone or not, and you got much less rolling resistance, and a horse or a mule could pull a lot more. And so, hey, let's go and put tracks in the street, and horse-drawn streetcars were created. And they really got going in the 1850s in New York, and they spread all around the country. And so starting in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, if you were any kind of a town, you ought to have a horse-drawn trolley in your town. And so they proliferated, went all over the country. And here's what it looked like in Minneapolis. And so this is the corner of Franklin and Chicago. Chicago Avenue was 8th Avenue at the time. And what you're looking at is the building on the left is the car barn. And the term car barn, even though it persisted with streetcars, well, it was a barn that had horses in it, so they called it a car barn. Had the streetcars as well. And the streetcars, by the time the 1880s came along, had built out, well, 2, maybe 3 miles from each of the downtowns. And the lines were through routed. This particular one went from about Lake in Chicago up through downtown, and then you'll notice it says Monroe Street. That's Monroe Street Northeast, and it went up Monroe to about Broadway, maybe a little bit past Broadway. And so, you know, it's about a 5-mile one-way trip. And by the time the horses made a completely round trip, they would have gone about 10 miles, and it was time to go and switch the teams out because they got tired. And so that's what you're looking at. They're switching the teams out on this. So this was standard procedure all over North America. Now, all starting in the 1870s and 80s, inventors were trying to figure out some way to mechanize horse-drawn streetcars for several reasons. First, they were slow. They went at basically the speed of about 5 miles an hour, speed of a walk. It took about 6, 7 horses to keep one of these things running because of the need to change the teams out. Horses got sick in the 1870s and later to a lesser extent in the 1880s. There was a horse respiratory disease called the Great Epizootic, and it just floored the horse population. Something like 40–50% of the horses got sick and really caused a great economic upset. There's a famous cartoon in a New York newspaper where they had so many horses down that they went and took inmates out of the jail and harnessed them up to pull the cars. And then, of course, horses deposited tons of manure on the streets, so it was a health and aesthetic issue. So you would think off-the-shelf power technology at the time was the steam locomotive. by the time you got into the 1860s, 70s, it was pretty much off the shelf. I mean, you know, they still had ways to go to perfect them, but it was a standard deal. And so you would think, well, they just put steam locomotives and haul the streetcars in the city. But there were some downsides to that. These things were little rolling pollution sources, and if laundry was hung out, it got covered with soot. These things threw off sparks, and the sparks fell on you and burned holes in your clothing. And the big problem was they scared horses. You know, and you know, steam coming out, and horses would get scared. And so they didn't get used very much for streetcars, especially in the city, but they did get used here once. This is the Minneapolis, Lyndale, and Minnetonka Railroad, which was a little independent transit line. And it started downtown Minneapolis, went through downtown on Marquette, out Nicollet Avenue, and it branched into three. It went out Nicollet to 50th Street to the Washburn Orphanage. It's sent a line across 37th Street and out to Minnehaha Falls, and across 31st Street and out to Lakes Calhoun and Harriet. And during the tourist boom of Lake Minnetonka from 1882 to 1886, they ran all the way out to Excelsior. And they were powered by little steam locomotives, and this is what they called a steam dummy. That car body that has built across on top of the locomotive is only to try not to scare horses. There were no passengers in it. It's an attempt to have an illusion. And this is the 31st and Nicollet. By the way, the reason there's a bus garage at 31st and Nicollet was that this little railroad built a roundhouse there. And then the streetcar company later replaced that with a streetcar barn and a streetcar factory, and then another streetcar barn, which then Twin City Lines converted to a bus garage, and then Metro Transit put another bus garage there in 1990, and that's why there's a transit facility on this site. But anyway, and from the day these things opened up, along Marquette Avenue in downtown, Upper Marquette, there were mansions where there are today office buildings. And one of the Washburns lived in one of them, and he campaigned against this thing from the day it opened up, to the point where in 1886 they actually experimented. The first experiment with an electric-powered locomotive to pull the cars happened. It was unsuccessful, and he got the city council that once these things got down to 6th and Marquette, they had to put horses on them and take them the rest of the way down to 1st Street. So not very popular, but it was one way to try. It was an unsuccessful way to try to mechanize streetcars. Well, 1873 in San Francisco, there was a steel rope, a manufacturer of steel woven rope, iron rope, called Andrew Halliday. And the story, which hasn't been proved one way or the other, was, you know what the hills are like in San Francisco. And he saw a horse car going up a hill. The horses lost their footing. They were dragged blocks down the hill. They had to be destroyed. And he said, I got to do something about that. That's the story. And so he perfected the cable car, which was born in San Francisco and now only exists in San Francisco. And the deal is that you have an unpowered streetcar, and you had a stationary steam engine in a powerhouse with big reels, and underneath the track, if you can see there, oh, that's right, I got a pointer. If you can see there, these slots between there, the continuous cable is running underneath there. There was a lot of infrastructure under the track with pulleys and all for this cable to go. The cable would have been like 2 or 3 miles long, moving at about 10 miles an hour. And the cable car had what they called a grip. If anybody ridden the cable cars in San Francisco up and down the hills, and you see the guy standing in the middle, that's the grip man, and he had the big lever. Pull the lever back, the grip goes down, grabs the cable, and off you go. You want to stop, you release the cable, apply the brake, and you stop. And that was the technology. Very expensive, very high maintenance, but it worked. And you could go twice as fast. The cables went 8, 9, 10, 12 miles an hour. And so about 25 cities across North America put in cables, and St. Paul was one of them. You're standing, today if you were standing on this spot, you'd look behind you and the St. Paul Cathedral would be there. And as a matter of fact, if you look down this hill today it's grass, but that retaining wall on the right is still there. You can see off in the distance the original state capitol, and this church is still there on 8th Street. Well, it's 7th Street now. If you know St. Paul, you know it used to be 8th Street. And so they built the line out Selby Avenue because of this hill, got out as far as Lexington. They built another line. This was 1886. They built another line out the long East 7th Street hill, which is about a mile-long hill going out East 7th to Duluth Street. And, of course, when St. Paul has something, Minneapolis wants it as well, and vice versa. You know how that goes. And so the Minneapolis City Council, seeing this, went to Thomas Lowry, who's the head of the streetcar system. And what you have to remember is the streetcars companies, they didn't just set up shop and build streetcar lines. They had to get a franchise from the city, and then there was a lot of give and take between the city and the streetcar company as to where they would build them and when they would build them. The cities had a tendency to want streetcars built ahead of development. The streetcar company wanted to wait for the development to happen so there'd actually be somebody to haul because they were dependent on the fares. And so there was a tension that went along. But anyway, the city of Minneapolis went to the Minneapolis Street Railway and said, we want cable cars too, and build 6 lines. And they went out and bought the cable car machinery and all the materials and stuff. And along came electricity just about then. And so Thomas Lowry, before they got the cable cars built in St. Paul, said, I'd like to take the 4th Avenue South line and convert a couple of cable cars to the new electric technology and see if it works. And he did that in December of 1889, made it through a blizzard, and said, this is working. Can I please abandon the cable cars? And the city council said, yes, you can. And in 1930, they finally paid off the cable car bonds. But the cable cars were finally happening. Now, a little bit of background on how they got electricity. Starting in the 1880s, several inventors, including Thomas Edison, were trying to figure out how you harness the electric fluid. They really didn't know what it was, but that's what they referred to it, to go and power a streetcar. And there was a lot of trial and error. There were several parallel research efforts. The guy who finally got it done was a guy named Frank Sprague. He came up with the combination of how you take the overhead wire, how you put the overhead wire up and get current off it and regulate it and get it to the motors and gear it to the wheels and all that worked. There were a couple other guys who had imperfect systems. They were sort of the Betamaxes of streetcars. And Sprague's first successful one was in the beginning of 1888 in Richmond, Virginia, which included, by the way, some really steep hills. And once that was proven to be a success, in what I think is the fastest adoption of a technology in American history, in about 5 years, Sprague's patents, his technology, replaced something like 90% of all the horse-drawn streetcars, the steam-powered streetcars, and the cable cars in North America. Including replacing the few systems that his Betamax competitors had put in. And so streetcars, electric streetcars had several advantages. They're much cheaper than a cable car to build, much faster. You could go 15, 20, 25, 30 miles an hour. Nobody had ever gone 30 miles an hour in a public street before. And newspaper editorials were written that our children were in danger, and preachers from the pulpit questioned whether God was in favor of this. But people liked the idea that suddenly you could get from one side of the city to the other in a considerably faster time. And so the first streetcars that they built were really kind of overgrown versions of the horse cars. Horse cars had been made as light as possible and small, but they were these little 2-axle, 4-truck cars. And this is the end of the Kenwood line, by the way, out at 21st. And Penn and Kenwood, and they looked like this. But unfortunately, there were a couple of things in Minnesota that they didn't take into account. First was, when you had a horse car and it was ambling along at 5 miles per hour, it took a lot of energy out of the horse and wasted a lot of time to actually stop the thing to pick up a passenger. And so they only stopped them for women and children, the elderly and the infirm. And if you were an able-bodied male, you were expected to just swing on and off the horse car when it went by, because it was only going like 5 miles an hour. It's not a big deal, and you saved the horse's energy and you got there quicker. Well, now they're going 15, 20 miles an hour, and the men are blithely swinging on and off. and are starting to get run over, slip under the car, have amputations. And so it occurred to the streetcar company that they really should stop for everyone. And furthermore, enclose the steps to get into the streetcar with wire gates, which, by the way, was termed the Minneapolis Gate in trade publications. And so they did. Well, the other thing is, if you were a horse car driver, you were a teamster. And you were driving a horse, and you stood out on the platform in all kinds of weather. And the other thing that they did not take into account was wind chill when they were suddenly going 20, 25 miles an hour. And we have pictures of the early streetcar drivers on the platform with like full-length fur coats. And this went on until in St. Paul, a driver froze to death at the controls. This was 1893, and the state legislature took up a work rule piece of legislation, which was that the streetcar companies had to enclose the front platform of their streetcar so the streetcar operator wouldn't freeze to death. And so by 1896, if you look on here, here you can see the wire gate on the back, and here you see the front platform is enclosed. So as the streetcar company built the tracks, and they were building them as fast as they could, and as a result, it spurred development in the city because it opened up new neighborhoods for development. And the streetcar company was overwhelmed with ridership. Not only that, but they discovered that these little streetcars, which by the way were commercially built, you went to a streetcar builder to get them, they had several disadvantages. First, they were small. And so after a while, they started pulling trailers. With the trailers, they turned a lot of the old horse cars into trailers. So you'd have an extra conductor on the trailer, but the trailers banged back and forth and were uncomfortable. And the cars themselves, they both rode rough and they bounced. They had narrow aisles with everyone facing the aisle, so people had a tendency to get their toes trod on when people were getting on and off, and they were just kind of not up to the task. And they weren't very good in snow. And I found newspaper stories where they would have a plow that they were pushing, and they'd have 6 of these things lined up behind it trying to get enough oomph to get the plow through the snow. So they said, we really got to have a better streetcar. Now, by this time, standard deal on steam railroads was the double truck car. Trucks are the wheel assemblies under the car. And so if you had a double truck car, it'd be 40, 50 feet long, with a swiveling set of trucks underneath it, and you had a very stable ride, you had a larger vehicle, and it was much more comfortable. So the streetcar company said, yes, let's get some of that. And they ordered 20 of them from a commercial car builder, put them on University Avenue, and they liked them. And so Thomas Lowry said, we can build our own and we can do it better, and something that is for Minnesota winters. And so starting in 1898, they began building their old streetcars, and these are 2 of the first ones. But this, by the way, is the Y at Indian Mounds Park. And these 2 cars are in sightseer service. It was such a novelty at the time that they went and ran sightseers twice a day. They made a loop in Minneapolis, a loop in St. Paul. They met at the city limits, and you could do both cities if you wanted. I should also tell you there was a great fad from about the early 1890s when these came in until about 1907, 1908 of streetcar parties, where you could hire a streetcar. They were happy to charter a streetcar to go wherever you wanted, but because now you had a vehicle that was big enough to accommodate a pretty good group. If you think about it before, if you'd done that in a carriage before, it'd be a pretty small group. It was big enough to accommodate a group. You could bring musicians on, you could have food. It was electrically lit, you could do it at night. It took you further to places like Como Park or Lake Harriet. And so there was a big fad. And I've done a little research, and in the society pages, the women's pages of the old newspapers, these things would be announced. So-and-so on such and such a date, Mrs. So-and-so is having a streetcar party, or such and such a group is having a streetcar party. And they're going to, go to this spot and pick up the streetcar and off you go. So they were done for all sorts of purposes. Anyway, the streetcar company began building streetcars, and the design evolved. Now, this photo was taken in 1921, and they had kept the very first St. Paul streetcar, 1872, just as a history piece. And by the way, it was in a building at the Snelling shops that burned down in 1925, or we'd still have it today. But anyway, this shows 50 years of development. And over time, they refined the design. They shifted from wood underframes to steel underframes. They put a front door in the front exit in the front, so now you could have a one-way flow through the car. But they built these things. They built 1,200 of them from 1898 to 1917. And these are the wood streetcars that you remember, because they ran until the end. So that was kind of the primer on how the streetcar systems got to be. Now we're going to go around the state, and there's a lot of slides. So if you're looking for a lot of slides of Minneapolis and St. Paul, I don't have them here because I'm trying not to crowd everyone else out. But here, this is Thomas Lowry. And Lowry is really the guy who built the Twin Cities system and the Duluth system, which meant by far the vast majority of all streetcars in Minnesota. He came out of Illinois. He was an attorney. Abraham Lincoln was his father's attorney. And as a matter of fact, he was a great aficionado of Abraham Lincoln, to the point where, a side diversion, in Abraham Lincoln's funeral car that transported his body back to Illinois after he was assassinated was sold to the Union Pacific Railroad and was there as an official's car until about 1880 or so, when it was obsolete. And it passed through a number of private hands, was displayed at some of the little World's Fairs like St. Louis and all, and was kind of in deterioration and was available, and Thomas Lowry bought it in 1905. And he had it brought up to the Nicollet shops at that 31st and Nicollet, the one where I showed you, where he was building streetcars at the time, and he restored it. And we have a picture of it at the shops with a bunch of streetcars in the foreground getting fixed up. And then he moved it up to 37th, well, about 35th and Central, where he owned land in northeast Minneapolis, just shy of Columbia Heights. And displayed it there. The Grand Army of the Public came and did pilgrimages to it every year. We have in our collection a brochure showing how to get there on the Twin Cities streetcar to visit it. And in 1911, a brush fire came along and it burned to the ground. But kind of an amazing piece of history. I was amazed when I visited the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, which is a corporately owned but nonprofit museum of the Union Pacific Railroad in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And I walked in there, and by gosh, they had furniture out of the Lincoln funeral car. They had kept it when they sold the car. Anyway, I diverted. So anyway, Lowry formed a syndicate in the 1870s, bought up the Minneapolis Street Railway and the St. Paul City Railway. At the time, the two were not connected. They each had separate franchises. Well, he put them together via University Avenue in 1890. That was the first connection between the two. Eventually connected them via Como Avenue and via Lake Street, and via Fort Snelling. He financed the system because he wound up building over 500 miles of track with private money. And he had to go out east periodically to raise money. And in 1892, when he went out, the financiers said, you know, if you were to merge the companies, you'd have a better chance of raising the money. And so he merged them into Twin City Rapid Transit, or, as noted, the public Twin City lines. And the Minneapolis Street Railway, the St. Paul City Railway were still subsidiaries. There were corporate subsidiaries for the suburban operation, for the steamboats, and also for their manufacturing stuff. And this is 1909, and you can see that it's a pretty big operation. You got within St. Paul, within Minneapolis, and mind you, the system had not filled out yet. It wound up getting all the way down to the city limits eventually. It certainly filled in Highland Park, but it also stretched out. It went through North St. Paul, White Bear Lake, Matamidi, out to Stillwater, Oak Park Heights, and Bayport. In the other direction, St. Louis Park, Hopkins, Deep Haven, and the main line out through Minnetonka to Excelsior and to Tonka Bay. And then beyond that, if you see the dotted lines on Lake Minnetonka here, the streetcar pulled into Excelsior, there were 4 steamboats sitting there, and the steamboats were built to look like streetcars. How many of you have ridden the Minnehaha out on Lake Minnetonka? Well, you know what I'm talking about. So They were designed by Royal Moore of Moore Boat Works out in Wayzata, but they were built at that same shop, 31st and Nicollet, and transported on streetcar wheels out to Lake Minnetonka in 1906. And so at Excelsior, there would be one of these. There was a route to Deep Haven and Wayzata, a route to Minnetonka Beach, a route to Spring Park, and a route to Zumbra Heights. There were also, he created Big Island Park on Lake Minnetonka, and from 1905 to 1911, which is all longer the park lasted, he had 3 big side paddle wheel ferry boats that shuttled people out there. That's this little line right there. By the way, I want to put a plug in for Paul Maravellis, a really good historian with the Lake Minnetonka Historical Society, has just come out with his book on the history of Big Island. And I mean, he researched it to death, all the residents, the full history of the park, stuff I've never seen before. He just came out self-published, and if you can find that book and you're into Lake Minnetonka history, you should buy it. They went down to South St. Paul. By the way, in the process, they eliminated a whole network of suburban trains. Most people don't even know these existed. Before the streetcars connected the cities in 1890, there were 3 different suburban trains connecting the downtowns. There was the Milwaukee Road that went down the short line. There was the Great Northern that went down, down the Great Northern, and then there was the Minneapolis and St. Louis that used the Northern Pacific tracks by a little bit northern route. They each ran a train every hour between the downtowns. The Great Northern ones ran on the half hour, the Milwaukee Roads on the hour, and the Minneapolis and St. Louis at 15 past the hour. They served intermediate stations. As a matter of fact, some of the places that you know started as stations on these commuter railroads, and those are St. Anthony Park, Miriam Park, Denoyer Park, Prospect Park. They like park. There were also trains on the Northern Pacific out to White Bear Lake, Matamidi, and Stillwater, on the Chicago and Northwestern to Stillwater, on the Chicago Great Western down to South St. Paul. Those were replaced by the streetcars. There were on the Minneapolis and St. Louis to Excelsior, on the Great Northern to Wayzata and Mound, and on the Milwaukee Road to Deep Haven. As a matter of fact, when the streetcar company, this line right here, out to Deep Haven, they simply leased it from the Milwaukee Road, strung overhead wire on it, and ran it. And this little tail end right here, they leased that from the Minneapolis and St. Louis. So the streetcars tended to put these commuter trains out of business, except some of them, like the ones out to White Bear and the Burlington down to St. Paul Park, lasted until 1930. Very unknown chapter in transportation history. Okay, so that's the streetcar. That's how far they went, and you could go anywhere. And this is the system as it was in 1948. And it still went out to Hopkins off the map here. But the red lines are the streetcars, and they're kind of a little bit hard to see on this, but if you can see green dashed lines, those are buses. They actually started running buses in 1924. What had happened was that automobiles came along, and it didn't take long for people to figure out, gee, I'm driving down the streetcar line, there's people waiting, why don't I just pull over, say, hey, give me your nickel fare and I'll take you where you want to go. And that was the rise of the jitneys during World War I. And the jitneys, you know how you've seen it lately with AI, where technology outpaces regulation? This was a case in point. And so the streetcar company cried foul and said, look, we're the one with the franchise to doing this. These people are stealing our customers. And over the next few years, all across North America, the cities outlawed jitneys. Well, then along came unregulated buses. And soon there were 3 bus lines running on University Avenue between Minneapolis and St. Paul, stealing the passengers. And Twin City Lines didn't wait for regulation. They just bought up all the bus competitors and did it that way. So anyway, so because there was a franchise, the goal of the city was to get everyone within a quarter-mile walk of a streetcar line. And this is a map from 1925, put out by the city of Minneapolis, and the shading is a quarter mile, and you can see they were pretty successful. Now, the streetcar company wasn't happy because they were building out, they made them build out there where there was no ridership yet, but that filled in. And so that was the tug of war between the city and the streetcar company. So anyway, a couple of shots of what they looked like. Here you are down at 5th and Hennepin. That's the lumber exchange building on the left. You can see the Bell Telephone building in the distance. State Fair was a big thing. And I love this picture. This is about 1915. And everybody's posing there. On the right, on the right, that whole yard and loop was for the cars going to and from St. Paul. This was for the cars going to and from Minneapolis. And this extended in through where the DNR building is today, almost to the base of the grandstand ramp. And one of the things I love, I have a number of pictures of these, but you see they put on these spectacles and it says War of Nations tonight. I've got another one of these where it says the burning of Rome. And if you go out there, the letters today are exactly the same font when they're publicizing, which makes me wonder if they never got rid of them. But anyway, they called a lot of people to the State Fair. Here's a typical view. This is Grand Avenue, and I want to say Oxford. And this is what the city looked like. You know, Dutch elms over the street, and the streetcars ran down the center 2 lanes, and you walked out and into the track. You can see up on the pole there, that's the car stop sign. And here you are, you're at 7th and Wabasha in downtown St. Paul, and this was a big central point. A bunch of lines met here where 7th crossed Wabasha. And this right here, this little arch-windowed booth thing, that's the starter booth. They had a supervisor there whose job it was to, you know, keep the cars on schedule, call for extra cars if they needed them, short line them if they were late, give out information to the public. That was the case at 5th and Hennepin in Minneapolis. They had a starter down at 7 Corners in Minneapolis. And that's one of the PCC cars. That's one of the cars that they bought. They finally bought a car that they did not construct themselves after World War II. Much faster, streamlined. We've got one of those. So we're going to move around the state now. And Duluth Superior. And this was one system. It was, whoops, come on there. Here, the Twin Ports lines. It was not corporately controlled by Twin City Rapid Transit, but owned by the owners of Twin City Rapid Transit. And so Twin City Rapid Transit went and built all their streetcars for them. You may have heard about the Duluth Incline. They built the Duluth Incline for them. And of course, Duluth is a really interesting place because it's about 25 miles long and about 3 miles wide. And it's got hills like San Francisco and international steamships call there. It's an unusual town. Superior is as flat as Stillwater is hilly, and Superior is certainly inferior to Duluth, but I hope there's no cheeseheads in the audience who take offense. But they had a big streetcar system, and it was a challenging place to run because the population density was considerably less. It was about 1/3 of the Twin Cities. And plus you had the hills, and you had twice as much snow in the winter and some really cold weather, so it was a very challenging place to run. But they went all the way from Lester Park all the way out to Morgan Park and New Duluth, and the streetcars lasted here until 1939. And they started out with horse cars just on Superior Street, actually mule cars. They used mules in Duluth. But then they wound up, they got the big cars from the Twin Cities. We have one of those as well, runs on our line out at Excelsior. And this is way up on the hill. This is, it is just turned off 8th Street. And so at this point, you're 400 feet above Superior Street. And so this guy's, and this particular line, and I have to believe that they constructed it this way for a reason. It went down 2 blocks and then went over. And then down 2 blocks and over, and down 2 blocks and over. And I think the reason for that was these cars were braked with air brakes, and the hills were steep. And I think they've only got so much air, and I think when they pulled onto the parallel street that was level, it gave them a chance to pump up the air and not run away, because they only had 1 runaway in the whole history of this operation. Now, the showpiece of the system was the 7th Avenue West Incline. There is no 7th Avenue West other than it was a platted street, and they built this thing in it to get up to the top of the hill. And that was to serve the Highland real estate development, which could only be reached by this. So up at the top of the hill, when they got off, there was an isolated 2-mile-long streetcar line that ran over to this neighborhood. But it was a little incline. It had cars that counterweighted each other, and this lasted until 1939, and there you see it fed the streetcars down on Superior Street. Now, as a matter of fact, apparently, there were sidewalks and stairways that went along this, and they're finally apparently going to put some history signs up along it. I just got a call from a guy from the park board in Duluth, and they're looking for some pictures. One of the real unusual things about this was the harbor crossing to get over to Superior. And so you're on the Duluth end right now, and it went across this bridge and came down on the other end, went across another bridge over what they called Howard's Pocket, which had a shipyard in it. So they had, and this line, unfortunately, was always interrupted several times a day by the bridge having to swing open so the boats could go through. So that they, and this thing got hit a couple times too, and the bridge got knocked off into the harbor. When they originally, before they built this bridge in, I want to say 1892, they had separate lines in Superior and Duluth that came to the shore, and then they had ferry boats that went across between them. But what they did in the winter of I want to say, no, they didn't build this bridge until like 98, that's right. So in the winter of like 92, they came up with a scow, a thing, it was on a scow thing, and it was on cables, and they had pulleys on each end, and they would pull this thing across the ice. And if it went in the water, it would float. And then the subsequent 3 years, they went and built a temporary wood trestle on the ice and ran a streetcar across it. So they were really glad when this bridge got built. So Duluth, the streetcars quit in 1939, but they were replaced with electric trolley buses. Electric trolley buses, starting in the 1930s, the Great Depression killed off lots and lots of small town and small city streetcar lines. And especially in larger towns, there were not yet gasoline-powered buses that were big enough to replace a streetcar one-for-one. But there were electric buses. And the streetcar companies, they knew about electric power. They had power generation. All you had to do was to put up a second wire. You'll notice that a streetcar, there's only one wire because the rail is the negative to return the power to the powerhouse. They put up a second wire, and trolley buses could pull over to the curb. And so trolley buses got put in about 70 cities in North America to replace streetcars. But they pretty much went away starting about in the 1960s because they cost more to operate and everything than diesel buses, but they're still in about a half a dozen cities. They're in San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, Toronto has them, Boston has some, Dayton, Ohio, for some reason, has them. Nobody knows why. So anyway, that was Duluth. Once again, I'm going to skip around here because we've got a lot of ground to cover. This is the Anoka Street Railway. This is the only known photo. And it was a little horse car line in the 1880s in Anoka, and it actually ran across the river, Mississippi to Champlin, and it ran for about, I don't know, 5-6 years and quit. One of the things, streetcar companies had a tendency to be financially not very stable. A lot of them got built and declared bankruptcy. And so trolleys would come back to Anoka in about 1910, but I'll show you that later because that's a little bit of a different critter. The very first electric streetcars in Minnesota were not in Minneapolis and St. Paul, which got them in late 1889, St. Paul, January 1990. In June of 1889, the Stillwater Street Railway started. And it ran down on Main Street in Stillwater, and then it climbed both the North Hill and the South Hill. And we only have a couple of pictures of it. This is at the corner of 3rd and Chestnut. There were some steps that came down. This is up on the hill somewhere, I'm not quite sure where. But I think this had an impact on what Twin City Rapid Transit did because they were able to go out and see this. And this thing here climbed the steepest hills outside of Duluth in Minnesota. It's really challenging hills. So it only ran for about 4 or 5 years in the 1890s and went out of business, I want to say 1897. So Stillwater wanted to get another streetcar company in. Twin City Rapid Transit said, we want to extend all the way from St. Paul out to Stillwater. And the Stillwater City Council said, you can get the franchise if you bring back local streetcars within Stillwater. And so in 1899, Twin City Rapid Transit did it. They built out from White Bear Lake, and they put in 3 lines, one to the North Hill, one to the South Hill, and all the way to Bayport, and another one, and one to South Hill all the way to Bayport. And so this is their early cars running about 1900. That's the main intersection, that's Main and Chestnut. All those buildings are still there. And here is one of the cars later that they built. This is about 1902, 1903. They replaced them with some of their home-built cars. This is a block away from there. You're looking down Main Street. Once again, if you go there today, all these buildings are there. And then in 1925, they built 4 of these lightweight cars, of their own manufacture. And so they lasted out here until 1932. Now there was one, the line down to Bayport, the trolley was there before the prison, but it was very convenient, so here it is stopping at the front door of the prison. And so periodically, if they had to transport prisoners out of the city, they'd charter a streetcar. And if you've been in our car or know what they're like, there's brass handholds on the ends of the seat, and they'd handcuff the prisoners to the brass handholds and take them out to Stillwater. They also, the line out to Stillwater, the first car in the morning that went out was stopped by the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and the front half of the car would be loaded with bundles of newspapers, and they'd toss those out as they went out there. It was a way to do it. And so this is down to Bayport, at the end of the line of Bayport with one of their little 1925 built cars. Okay, next up is Winona. Winona had horse cars, and Winona only had a couple, 3 lines. This is their Main Street, 3rd Street, the heart of downtown. Once again, a lot of it still sort of looks that way. They had a line that went across Lake Winona, and the reason it went across Lake Winona was that there was a big park on the other side and a cemetery. And they went and got some new cars in about 1910, and this car, number 10, we have today. It got turned into a cabin, and we got it back and turned it back into a streetcar, which took 15 years and about $250,000 and a lot of man hours. And we colorized this photo. That's how we have it painted up today. I'll show you a picture of it later. But a little typical small city streetcar. The small city streetcars tended to use single truck, 2-axle cars just because they didn't need the capacity. And by the way, this was owned, what was rather common in small cities was for the electric utility to own the streetcar company, because the streetcars came along at the time they were wiring the town for the first time for electricity. And so not only was the streetcar company a customer, but hey, you were wiring down that street anyway, so you can put the overhead wires and the power lines to the residential neighborhoods at the same time. And so this was originally Winona Power and Light. It was merged into Mississippi Valley Public Service, and that company ran the streetcars both in Winona and La Crosse. Mankato. There's Front Street in Mankato. This doesn't look like this today. They went and plopped a mall down, and closed the street. But they had 2 lines. You're looking at them both. The main line, that's the main line car there, and that's the Hill line car that ran up the hill by the Teachers College on 4th Street. Here's another view of that same intersection, turning 90 degrees, looking up the hill. This thing, they had horse cars for a very short time in Mankato, and they went away, and then they replaced them in 1907 with these. Here's the line headed up the hill. To show you how steep this was, we also have a picture of these blocks up here with a toboggan run set up next to the tracks in the wintertime. And here it is going through the city park on Lover's Lane, which I think is kind of cute. St. Cloud, Waite Park. There was a streetcar system in St. Cloud, and it went to Waite Park and Sauk Rapids. And here it is at the center, which is 5th and St. Germain Street in downtown St. Cloud. If you look carefully, you can see the track turning onto 5th Street here. And so they only had 2 lines. They had one line that went down 5th Street and down by the college, and then another line that crossed the Mississippi River, went all the way over to Sauk Rapids, and then the other direction went through open country to Waite Park. Now this is the line through open country to Waite Park, and now there wasn't a lot of Waite Park, but what there was the Great Northern Railroad's car building shops and car repair shops. And every morning, because hundreds of people worked there, every morning they put together about 12 streetcars, including hauling trailers, and ran them, started in the south side of St. Cloud, and picked up passengers until that car was full, and then ran it express to Waite Park, and then the next one following started picking up the next ones and ran them express. And there were 2 cars that came out of Sauk Rapids and ran express, and so you had like 12, 15 carloads of streetcars for the shift. And those cars all sat in Waite Park for the day. The crews went back to St. Cloud in one car, and then they repeated it in reverse. This same thing happened in Duluth. During World War I, they had McDougall Shipyard out in far west Duluth, and then the Morgan Park steel plant. And in the morning rush hour, they sent about 30 streetcars worth of people out to the steel plant and to the shipyard, coming out of Duluth, out of West Duluth, and then out of Gary, New Duluth. That's how many people were riding the streetcars to get to these places. They also did it in Dilworth, Minnesota, out of Fargo and Moorhead. They had about 10 streetcars worth that went out there for the shift change, just to show what it was like. People didn't have automobiles. So this is out there, kind of in that open country between them. Here's the one headed for Sauk Rapids. You can see there in the distance the Mississippi River Bridge on St. Germain Street. And here he's just crossed the bridge, and now he's turning parallel to the Mississippi River to head for Sauk Rapids. They had the biggest destination signs of any cars. Let's see. See, there's no question that that car was going to Sauk Rapids. Now what's interesting is this is a car they got used from Duluth. And they bought, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these used from Duluth. And we have one of this series that ran in Duluth, and you'll see we've restored it, and you'll see a picture of it. It's a car from 1892. Brainerd had horse cars for a little bit, and then they had a very short-lived streetcar system, lasted for about 3 years. And it appears, with one exception in Minnesota, that if you wanted to keep a streetcar line running on kind of a permanent basis, you needed at least 10,000 people. Brainerd had 3,000 or something like that. And so what you're looking at here is the entire streetcar company. This is all the employees. These 4 cars are all the streetcars. They're at the car barn and the powerhouse on the north side of town, and the reason they put it there was they were next to a sawmill. And the powerhouse was powered to generate the electricity with the scraps from the sawmill. So this thing ran from about 1896 to 1898. Here, little big cars like this didn't handle snow too well, which is probably what happened here. And here you are in downtown Brainerd, and I think this thing went away before they enclosed the front platforms on this little system. And it finally quit because there was a trestle on the north side of town they had to go across, and the trestle collapsed, and that put them out of business. Now this is my favorite here, Wahpeton Breckenridge. Now we're talking Wahpeton, North Dakota to Breckenridge, Minnesota. So it was an interstate operation that had to report to the Interstate Commerce Commission, but it was 1 mile long and had 2 streetcars. And there's one of them. There's streetcar number 2. So that's in downtown Breckenridge. And this thing ran from 1910 to I want to say 25. And it was the only streetcar system I can think of. It's hard to call it a system when there's one line, which had to compete with walking. And I did a story for the magazine. I was trying to figure out what the frequency was, and I think the frequency was every 20 minutes. Because you could walk from one to the other in 20 minutes. So if you ran less often than that, what was the incentive? And so here's the interstate bridge between the 2 cities, and here you are at the end of the line over in downtown Wahpeton, North Dakota. And so on a Sunday, they would sometimes put out 2 cars if there was a ball game or something going on. Now here's one of the things that kept this going longer. Wapaton was dry and Breckenridge was wet. So Wapaton, North Dakota didn't have any bars, and Breckenridge had like a dozen. And even though the total population of the two towns was about 3,000. And the other thing was Sunday movies were legal in Minnesota, but not in North Dakota. And I think the two-car operation often was on Sundays when the movies were showing. But interestingly, I went up there in 1995 to research it and visit the local historical societies, which is where I got those photos from. And the car barn was still there, with the tracks coming out from under the pavement into the car barn. Now it's torn down now, there's a plaque, but I couldn't believe it. It was somebody had bought it, used it as a garage or something. Okay, Fargo, Moorhead, Dilworth. Another interstate streetcar operation. Here's downtown Fargo, Broadway, Fargo Theater, another view on Broadway. And what they would do is at the corner of Broadway and Northern Pacific Avenue, they'd bring the cars together. This was classic small town thing. On the hour and the half hour, and the cars would come together, sit for 5-10 minutes or so, exchange passengers, and then go their separate ways. And that's how you could get to the different neighborhoods. And then it crossed the line over into Moorhead. Here it is on the bridge crossing the Red River and coming into Moorhead. And in the center of Moorhead, they had two lines, and so they also would meet there. They went out to the State Normal School, which is now Moorhead State University, and it ran right into the campus. 3 miles east of Moorhead, through open country, is the town of Dilworth. And the only reason Dilworth was there was that it was the division point, shop town for the Northern Pacific Railroad. They didn't want to do it in Moorhead, they did it just kind of outside of Moorhead. So they had a roundhouse and a big yard and everything. And so the Northern Pacific was running a train from Fargo and Moorhead for 500 shop employees every day. And they wanted to get out from under it. And so the local chambers of commerce went and bought the right-of-way parallel to the Northern Pacific. And the streetcar company built out there in 1912, I think. And once again, you had a situation like at Waite Park, where every morning for the shift break, you had a dozen streetcars run out through the open country out to Dilworth. Now, this was also owned by Northern States Power, or the company that became Northern States Power. And if you go out there today, you can see where the streetcar ran because the power line is there. Because they extended power to Dilworth at the very same time that they put the streetcar line out. It was classic. And so this continued, the streetcars in there continued until 1936, 37, I guess. One little digression here. All the small city streetcar systems, other than the Twin Cities, quit in the 1930s, in the late 1930s. And it turns out that one of the reasons for that was a law passed by Congress, which now I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was like the Utilities Subsidiary Act or something. Electric utilities in the 1920s had consolidated. They started with small power companies everywhere, and they consolidated into about eight enormous utility companies all across the nation. And they had monopoly power, and they rigged rates, but they were regulated as utilities, and so they could only have so much profit. So what they did is they had unregulated subsidiaries, which included these streetcar companies, and they would go and launder the excess revenue through these small streetcar companies and other subsidiaries. And in the Great Depression, Congress caught on. This was during Roosevelt, and they made the utility companies divest themselves of their unregulated subsidiaries, which included the streetcars. And so it turns out that these streetcar companies in Fargo-Moorhead and in St. Cloud, both of whom were owned by NSP, and in Winona, owned by Mississippi Valley Public Service, had been kept alive longer than they otherwise would have been during the Depression as a place to launder excess profits, and also they were electricity customers, which didn't hurt. And so all three of those companies converted, sold off their streetcars, got rid of the streetcars, and sold the transit operation to private bus companies in the late 1930s. And I didn't know that until recently. Grand Forks, East Grand Forks. It was mostly Grand Forks. there was one line that went over the river into East Grand Forks, Minnesota, but we cover it anyway. Now here's a classic little streetcar. This is your standard 1905 small city streetcar. And the interesting thing about this is it may not be this one, it may be one of its peers in the same group, but it still exists. And out in Mandan, North Dakota, there was an abandoned Northern Pacific branch line that went from Mandan down to Fort Lincoln, which is a historic fort down the west side of the Missouri River. And a couple of old guys bought it, a couple of brothers who lived in Mandan bought it. This thing here was a car body that was being used, I think, as a dog kennel. And they went and they put an engine in it, a gas engine in it, and found a truck to put under it, and started running it on the line down to Fort Lincoln, 5 miles. And they have since built a newer one, so this one doesn't run much, but it's still there. They're in the process of selling the line right now. So this thing is for sale. I'm always amazed at what survives. By the way, the reason this thing went from Grand Forks down to Bismarck, North Dakota, was that there was a state-owned trolley line that went from the railroad stations on the main street in downtown Bismarck up the hill to the state capitol. And when Grand Forks went out of business, they bought this one, and that's how it wound up in Bismarck. So there's their car barn. You can see they got plow and a sweeper there for the snow. This is right in downtown Grand Forks. That's one of the 1920s Birney cars. That was the standard small town car from the 1920s. They were cheaper. They could be operated by one person. You didn't need a conductor. And so these things, there were about 5,000 of these things built and ran all over North America. Here's one of them out there in one of the neighborhoods. One of the least likely ones, I'm getting down to the end of the streetcar list, but there's more. There was a 6-mile line that went from International Falls to Rainier. This is it in Rainier, and they never strung overhead wire. This is a gasoline-powered streetcar from about 1905, probably not very reliable. They had a battery-powered one too, and I got a picture of the battery-powered one from the Koochiching County Historical Society, and the caption on the photo was, "Runs sometimes." And I like this picture, because look at the kids hanging on the bumper. And so this thing made something like 6 trips a day. And it only lasted, built in I think 1910, and it had its last gasp about 1919. But it ran through a lot of open country, and it really wasn't very viable. But it was a streetcar. Hibbing. If you know the history of Hibbing, you know that the original town site of Hibbing, the Hull Rust Mahoning mine is next to it, and they realized there was more iron ore under the town, so they went and moved the town. You know about that. They moved it about 2 miles south to what we now think of as Hibbing, and they simply dug away. And so they picked up a lot of the buildings and moved them, and they ran a streetcar line between the two because it took a few years to transition, so they were still traveling back and forth. Here you are at the end of the line, almost at the end in North Hibbing. And that's this was the very center. This was the Oliver Hotel. You'll see a picture of it in a little bit. And they cleared it all out, and just beyond this is the open pit. And we have this picture by the Aubin Studios in Hibbing, but one of our members is a guy named Dick Stoner, and that's his dad, who was the motorman on that trip. Dick was born in Hibbing. Okay. So the streetcar companies come in the 1890s, and they get the double truck cars, and it doesn't take anyone very long to figure out, why don't we go and run some of these in between cities? And that created the term interurbans. And all across the country from about 1900 till about 1915 was the interurban craze, and 15,000 miles of these trolley lines between cities were built. And the cars were bigger and faster, more substantial. And they filled, they were a bridge technology. Essentially, the steam railroads ran to most of these places, but probably ran once, twice a day or something. And they stopped about every 5-10 miles or so. Well, if you were a farmer and you wanted to get in to the big city, or if you were in a small town and wanted to get to the larger city, now these things were cheap enough to build and very cheap to operate, and you could, instead of having a train with a 5-man crew on it burning coal, you had a trolley car with a conductor and a motorman, and all it used was electricity. So suddenly you could go and build lines between cities that weren't all that long necessarily, and run something once an hour. And not only that, but there was no smoke and soot and cinders and everything. And so this kind of swept the country. There was a great deal of speculation on them, a lot of money raised, and these were all the places where they proposed to do it in Minnesota. Now, if you look very carefully, you can see a little black line. Here's to Stillwater, because Twin City Lines built these, and to Lake Minnetonka. And there were two others. There was the line from Minneapolis to Anoka, the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna Range, which wanted to go all the way to the Cuyuna Range. That's this thing right here. It never made it to Anoka. And the St. Paul Southern, which went to Hastings and wanted to go all the way down the river. And the Mesabi Railway on the Iron Range. And that was it. That's the only one of all of these, but these were proposed. This one right here, is this thing working? There we go. This one right here from the Twin Cities, Duluth, was going to be a high-speed, mile-a-minute thing that would go nonstop. And they actually graded it. They actually graded it up in the area of kind of the big wildlife refuge. What's the name of the wildlife refuge northeast of? What was it? Yeah, right. It went kind of next to the Carlos A. River. It went through that area. And they actually graded like 20 miles of it, and it never got built. So those are interurbans. Well, of course, Twin City Lines, this is it just west of Stillwater. They went 50 miles an hour out to Stillwater. They did even better. They went 60 miles an hour out to Lake Minnetonka, but it qualified as an interurban. And by the way, because electricity was a novelty, they put lights up all along it and called it the Great White Way. This was the one that went to Anoka. It's in downtown Anoka, right next to the Rum River by the Pillsbury Mill. And if the streetcar looks like a Twin City streetcar, it's because that was built for them as Snelling shops. But it had a baggage compartment. And this is the St. Paul Southern. There it is in downtown Hastings. If you go out there, the buildings are still there. And they weren't very successful. This one here never turned a profit, but they lasted until the 20s or the 30s. The most ambitious one was the Mesabi Railway, which ran the length of the Iron Range. And if you look at the map here, you can see it went all the way from Gilbert and Eveleth through Virginia. I wonder if the battery of this is dead. Through Virginia, Mountain Iron, Buell, Chisholm to Hibbing. And it revolutionized life on the Iron Range because there had been like one train a day, 2 trains a day, and didn't go to all the towns. Now there was a train every half hour between the towns. This is a 30-mile stretch here. And it tied it together. So I looked at old newspapers, and because of this, they started a baseball league where the towns could go, the teams could travel, and the fans could travel. It started a card league. Boy, I'm blocking on stuff. What's the big card game? Not poker. Yeah, not that either. But I can't. Not canasta. I'm blocking on the one. But what? No, doesn't matter. Whatever. It started a card league that moved all around the thing. It really kind of revolutionized life on the range. Here's a colorized photo, and this is in North Hibbing. That's in front of the Oliver Hotel. And so you can see the cars were big. They moved along at about 50 miles an hour or so. And by the way, on the Iron Range, it turned out that Hibbing and Chisholm were in an area, and I don't really understand the history of this, but that had been named as Chippewa Reservation land. And there was a big court case that was settled that determined that there was no liquor to be sold within that reservation land. So they had to close the bars in Hibbing and Chisholm, but they kept them open in Buell just outside of that. And so the Interurban got a lot of riders going to the bars in Buell, and they were so disruptive on the train the drunks were that they wound up deputizing the conductors. So here you are in downtown Hibbing, and here you see baseball today. That's the league being done. And here you are at the other end of the line in Gilbert. But this thing performed quite a function. By the way, we have one of these cars. It's just a body. It's a long-term restoration project. It was a cabin, but we've got one. Okay, now we get to a group of interurbans that wanted to electrify, but never got around to it. And you know about Dan Patch. And have you heard about the Dan Patch line, the railroad that still runs through the western suburbs of the Twin Cities down to Northfield? It was created by Marion Savage, for whom Savage is named, and he owned Dan Patch, the racehorse, and so he named the railroad after that. And his goal was to go down to Rochester and to Dubuque, Iowa. So it was the Minneapolis, St. Paul, Rochester, and Dubuque Electric Traction Company, formed in 1910. And he got as far as Northfield, and not any further. Wound up grading it part of the way to Faribault, but never opened it up. And the idea was to run some freight, but mostly be a passenger railroad on the interurban model, meaning stops about every mile and cars about once an hour or so. But he didn't have the money for electricity, so he got early gasoline electric cars. This is the equivalent of a hybrid automobile, in that it is a gasoline engine that is powering power to electric motors that are down in the wheels. This shows you how slow the automotive industry has been to adopt something like this. This is 1910. And you'll notice the horseshoe logo for Dan Patch on the front of it. And he got a pretty good business going down to Antlers Park in Lakeville. He developed that as a resort. This was really common to go as a traffic generator, create some kind of a resort that was nearby. Dan Patch wound up dying in 1916, I think it was. And Savage, who had just come off a minor hernia operation, was so stricken that he died a week later. And his railroad, which was a house of cards financially, went bankrupt immediately, sold off most of these gas cars, reincorporated as the Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern Railroad, and had a very successful several decades as a freight hauler, and much of the line is still there. So that was one of these wannabe interurbans. Other one was the Luce electric lines. You know the Luce Line Trail? Luce is the family that bankrolled this, and only a little bit of that railroad still exists out in Plymouth. But it basically went out parallel to Highway 7 through Hutchinson, and it was going to go all the way out into South Dakota to Watertown, and it was going to go down to Marshall, and it was going to go down to New Ulm, and it never went to any of those places. But it got as far as Glick, Minnesota, which is just west of Clara City and Raymond. And it was named, there was nothing there, but the Glick family that owned the brewery were some of the people who bankrolled this line, so they now have a town named Glick. And it also ran with General Electric gas cars. And this is they had a terminal, a joint terminal in downtown Minneapolis. That's the Butler building behind it. And so if you're looking at this today, this is the big parking ramp A that's next to Target Field. That's why it's not there anymore. And the track was there until they built the parking ramp. Just a word about buses. Buses came in, I told you, unregulated. This is one of the unregulated buses in 1918 on University Avenue, just east of Fairview. And Twin City Rapid Transit got really into the bus business starting in 1924 and figured out, not surprisingly, I need a drink here, not surprisingly, that you could run buses cheaper than you could build streetcar lines. So if you had a suburban market or a lightly traveled neighborhood in the Twin Cities, you could put buses in. So they started putting in buses. This is in downtown St. Paul, and this one went out to White Bear Lake on New Highway 61. And then, so the Depression came along, and they finally started taking their lighter patronized service and converting it to bus. And this is the first day of the Kenwood St. Louis Park bus, which, by the way, was a victim of Highway 100. The St. Louis Park line crossed what would be Highway 100, and the streetcar company was looking for an excuse to get rid of the line, didn't want to pay for tracks in the new bridge over Highway 100. So let's convert it to bus. And this, by the way, was the first of their Mack buses that really looked like what you think of a bus today, with a flat front and the engine in the rear. And so going into World War II, buses were about 10% of the streetcar company ridership. Coming out of World War II, they were about 13, 14%. And then thereafter, all across the country, the big transit systems began converting from streetcar to bus. And Twin City Rapid Transit wound up, at first they wanted to keep kind of a core of the heavy streetcar lines, University Avenue, Lake Street, that kind of stuff. But their stock was taken over by a Wall Street guy who bought them out in 1949, and then he was replaced by another guy who you saw burning down the streetcar earlier. And that group went, and as fast as they could, from about 1950 to 54, they got rid of them. And in fact, they had some challenges doing it because most of the streetcar fleet, the wood streetcars, were pretty well used up. They were 30 to 40 years old. The electric power system, which that was the power plant at the east end of the Stone Arch Bridge. It's still there, serves the U of M, but it's been greatly modified. All its workings were obsolete, and they would have had to pay a lot of money to replace it. And so General Motors said, we'll finance 500 buses for you. And here you see the bus parade next to Dayton's in downtown to show the inauguration of this. So that was the end of the streetcars in 1954. I got a few more things to show you. There were the streetcar company in Minneapolis and St. Paul was the largest employer. Thousands of people worked for them, and over the years, they hired tons of Scandinavian immigrants. One of the things we got from Metro Transit back in the 90s, when they computerized their payroll records, they still had the employee appointment cards, little recipe-sized cards, one for each employee going back to 1891. So they gave them to us. And they were in 6 alphabets, one for each of the streetcar barn. So I and another one of our guys came over here. We donated them to MHS. We spent several months re-alphabetizing them into a single alphabet, and they're in the library now because they're very useful for genealogy. What you'll see in there is where when the person started, when they left, where they lived. You can tell where they worked, if they're a conductor or a motorman. And there's usually a couple of sentences in there about what kind of an employee they were and why they left. And I've never seen that many Scandinavian names in one place. Honest, there were tons and tons of immigrants, and also lots of farm kids. They like to hire farm kids. And so working as a motorman or conductor was not an easy job. It was a 10, 11-hour-a-day job that, because of split shifts for the rush hour, could take 13 to 14 hours from the start of your day to the end of the day. And it didn't pay that well, but you were in charge of a major piece of equipment. You were in a uniform. There was a certain amount of status. And because of that, you were better than a laborer. And we know this because in our collection, we have several hundred photos like this, where somebody went to the trouble of going in and hiring a professional photographer to take their picture because they were proud they were in the uniform. Or commercial photographers came out to the car barns at the end of the line and took a picture like this, posing them with their streetcar, and sold it to them. Or came in and posing them in the streetcar. And we have, from 1905 to 1917, they had these big hat badges with the numbers on, and we've got an index of the numbers. And sometimes we can identify them. So I'm going to get to the last part of this, and that is, if you were in about 1905, 1910, which, by the way, was the great postcard boom, the real photo postcard boom. And if you were any kind of a town, you had no status if you didn't have a streetcar. So a lot of small town photographers who did postcards went out and created fake streetcars. Here's Wilmer with a Twin City Lines car in it. And by the way, some of these are really badly done. There's Madison, Minnesota. That, by the way, is a streetcar from Milwaukee that ran between Milwaukee and various towns outside of Milwaukee, like Oshkosh. Let's see, this is Taylor's Falls. And that, by the way, is ran out of Plymouth, Wisconsin, Sheboygan Power and Light. And a sister to that one, number 26, has been completely restored and is running at the Trolley Museum in East Troy, Wisconsin. And this is Dawson, and as you can see, it's a little out of proportion. And this same streetcar appears in about a dozen other small town ones. And so we're getting down to the end here. Our host went and pointed out they're putting them back today. And, you know, now, at the time that the streetcars were there were no public subsidies, but there are now. And people do like rail. I have never met anyone nostalgic for a bus, but we get people who miss the streetcars. And so this is what has happened here. This is 5th Street in front of City Hall. And there's the University Avenue streetcar, and now there's the Blue Line light rail in exactly the same spot doing exactly the same thing. So anyway, we're the Minnesota Streetcar Museum, and if you come on out to Lake Harriet, we'll give you a ride in the summer. That's car 1300 on the right, built in 1908 at Snelling Shops, and Snelling Shops is where the soccer stadium is today. And that's car 322 that was bought for University Avenue, and it survived because it and a bunch of others went out to Newark, New Jersey. And then in 1978, the Newark cars ran until 2001. So there's 11 of them now running out in San Francisco. And this particular one was sold to Cleveland because they needed one. And I was working for Metro Transit, and so I had our general manager call up the general manager in Cleveland, and because this was a federally funded asset, they transferred it to Metro Transit, who donated it to us, and we spent 9 years restoring it, and now it's back. And now we have another streetcar line, which was built in conjunction with restoring the streetcar boat Minnehaha out in Excelsior. It's a long story why we have it, but that's why we have it. And it's got these streetcars, which that's Duluth number 265 on the left, which is a big Twin City car built in 1915, then sold to Duluth. And it was sold to Duluth because they needed it when they opened the steel plant in Morgan Park. They were short of cars. And next to it is Little 78. And that's the one from 1892 that was a shed. And for a long time we wondered, should we even bother, because it was just a shell? And then one of our members went over to Brussels, Belgium, and found an American power truck and brought it back, and that made it possible. And then the other one is Winona 10. And I showed you that one, and that one took 15 years. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
I was just wondering why the yellow? You know, like barns were always painted red. Was there because you could see them?
Well,
in
in the 1890s, they were orange with cream windows, and they went to the yellow in 1898 when they started building their own. And I really can't tell you why it was. They just did. By the way, I forgot to recognize several of our volunteers who run streetcar. Guys, stand up, would you? These folks down here. We've got about, something like 115 volunteers that keep the streetcars running at the Streetcar Museum. And we'll be running starting in May. And, you know, hope we can see you out there. By the way, if you want to see more, go to YouTube, put in the search box Minnesota Streetcar Museum, and we have a channel. And there's about 50 slideshows on there and lots of vintage video of when they were running. So including, I've even got a Duluth program there. Okay, do we have anybody who?
I've been curious to know about the subway line that runs underneath John Island Boulevard. Where does that come out on the other side?
It came out just east of Nina Street, which is a block west of the cathedral.
Okay.
Didn't the automobile industry was responsible for eliminating many of the trolleys that they wanted to promote, single-use vehicles?
Yes and no. After World War II, General Motors, Standard Oil, and Firestone got together and formed a company called National City Lines. And they bought up a bunch of streetcar lines, and in a few cases there were kickbacks and stuff like that was illegal, but for the most part they were taking advantage of a business opportunity that was coming because cities everywhere were getting rid of them. What happened here in the Twin Cities, that was not National City Lines, although they hired somebody from National City Lines to do the transition. But here, the stock of the company, a lot of the stock of the company had been purchased by Kid Can Blumenfeld and some of the other Minneapolis gangsters. And they went and paid kickbacks to the management of Twin City Lines to get way below market deals, not only on the scrap, the rails and the copper from the wires, but also on a lot of land that Twin City Lines sold off when they got rid of the streetcars, and people went to jail for that. And so what it was mostly, with a couple of cases of malfeasance, it was mostly GM and Firestone and all taking advantage of a business opportunity because there was this huge transition from streetcars away to buses. And a lot of that happened after World War II because GM finally came up with a bus, and Mack came up with a bus that was big enough and powerful enough with a diesel engine to actually replace the streetcar one-for-one in big city operations.
About 30 years ago, I did some research on streetcars in St. Paul, and I came across a number of periodicals in the 1920s here at the Historical Society put out by automobile clubs, these different ones in the town. There wasn't one like AAA. And in these periodicals, whether they were quarterlies or not in the 1920s, they would malign the streetcars endlessly and beg for them to be removed from the streets because of the traffic jams they caused. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't heard of that specific thing, but in general, when they were getting rid of them, automobile drivers disliked them for two reasons. The first one was it was illegal to pass a streetcar. It was like a school bus, because if you went around a streetcar, you might pick off somebody, you might hit somebody who was getting on or off. So if you were stuck behind a streetcar and it was stopping every block, you were stopping every block, whereas buses could pull over to the curb. That was one thing. The other thing back then is that tires were narrow, and in the wintertime, the streetcar tracks, there would be huge ruts where the rails were, and cars would get stuck in those ruts, and they didn't like that either. And so they were viewed as, get these things out of our way. But I didn't know that it was an organized thing like that.
It's a simplistic question. How do you differentiate streetcar from trolley, or are those two terms used interchangeably?
They are synonyms, but the term trolley comes from an early one. Remember one of the Betamax developers that was trying to do it, and he had two parallel wires up there rather than the negative be the track, and he put a little four-wheel cart on top of it called a troller, which was pulled with a cord behind the streetcar. It was not successful. They had a tendency to fall off the wire, crash into the car roof, and it was also very difficult. How did you switch them? But the troller is where trolley came from. And then after a while, it simply became a synonym for streetcar.
I was in Cleveland and was very impressed with their original red line that is still in operation, and they have a neighborhood called Shaker Heights. That is kind of no change for almost 100 years because. The neighborhood was built because of a streetcar. It's one of the streetcar neighborhoods. Was built by developer back in 1920s. So I wonder whether in the Twin Cities neighborhoods, there are any neighborhoods that still resemble with the original streetcar neighborhood caricature.
Yeah, the only one, the only suburban real streetcar neighborhood in the Twin Cities is the Country Club neighborhood in Edina, which is bounded by France, 44th, 50th, and Highway 100. And that was laid out, the streetcar line ran right along the north edge of it, and there were three stops placed specifically for that with shelters. That was the only real example of it happening here. And by the way, Shaker Heights, where you were at, a bunch of our streetcars, the PCC streetcars, went to Shaker Heights and ran there until later.
Yeah, I had a question about the hybrid trolley. They went 50 miles an hour and it was gasoline powered, but also actually powered the electricity, which I never even fathomed. So what happened to that? Where did they have that anywhere in America?
Yeah, they were actually, the ones you saw were a first generation of those, and they lasted in branch line service all across the country. There were a lot more of them, kind of a second generation of them built by a company called Electromotive, which later became Electromotive Company, starting in the 1920s through the 1930s, that were somewhat more reliable, the technology was better. And they were substituted for steam trains on branch lines and light haul situations all across the United States.
So when they were going 50 miles an hour, were they pretty efficient then? They must have been, right?
Oh, yeah, I mean, they go 50, 60.
No, I mean,
in a lot of cases, the track on those little branch lanes wouldn't allow a high speed,
Yeah.
but yeah, they'd bucket along at something like that.
With no problem, so for
Right,
years,
but
right?
it was a gasoline engine generating electricity
Wow.
to power motors, streetcar-type motors in the trucks.
All right, I think there's plenty more questions, but the museum does close in about 20 minutes, so I want to make sure we have time to get out of here. Another round of applause for our speaker, Aaron Isaacs.
Thank you.